1959, the greatest race of humankind began. It was a race between two countries, and it wasn't a marathon, it wasn't a sprint, it wasn't the Olympics. You could say it was an interstellar race. It was a race to the moon. It was a race between Russia and the United States, and in 1969, the United States of America won that race to the moon with the Apollo 11 rocket. When men stepped out, placed a flag, and uttered those such well-known words, "This is one small step for man, one..." But did it really happen? In 1954, one of the greatest careers of a musician began. It was a career that would redefine the music industry as we know it. It was a career that would have women maybe a little hot and bothered, and would have men complaining, and especially the churches railing against this career. It was the day that Elvis Presley stepped to the platform and began to shake his hips a little bit. But in 1977, Elvis died. Or did he? Sightings all over the place since 1977. Now, those sightings of a 40-year-old Elvis when he would actually be 90 seem a little bit far-stretched. But perhaps Elvis never actually passed. TV shows and movies have been made for decades about little green men living amongst us. There may or may not be some UFOs sitting there in Roswell, New Mexico at Area 51. Maybe we'll know soon. Maybe we'll never know. JFK's assassination, what really happened on that day? Is global warming really a thing? Or is it something that's just made up? COVID, that was an interesting one. Was it natural? Did it begin in a lab? Did it start in a certain country, or did it just start? I think it's time we find out, don't you? State secrets everywhere. Nixon, was he involved? Was he not involved? See, there are conspiracy theories all around us, and if we just turn on the news for a little bit, we'll eventually begin to hear about one of them. We'll eventually begin to hear either the far right or the far left accuse the other side of doing something nefarious that we may or may not believe, and many of these conspiracy theories are exactly that, conspiracies. But it turns out that some conspiracy theories are indeed true. Take Nixon and Watergate, for example. It began as nothing more than a conspiracy theory, but as the evidence unfolded in front of us, we began to find out, and by we, I mean I wasn't alive yet, so not me, but people began to find out that it did actually happen, that Nixon was indeed guilty, and the course of United States history changed forever, with the stepping down of a sitting president over a conspiracy theory that he had overseen. See, some conspiracy theories are true, and they are worth our time of researching them and figuring them out. But as we do so, there's a few things that we must do. We must avoid confirmation bias as we research these things. If you're looking for whether or not aliens do or do not exist, it is important as you begin to research to not just look for the evidence that supports your theory, but to also read through the evidence that does not support your theory. We have a tendency to find all of the things that point to what we believe and to ignore all the things that don't line up with it. When we're researching one of these conspiracy theories, it is important for us to ask questions, to not be afraid of the questions. When you see something that looks a little sketchy, when you see something that's a little questionable, ask the question. At the worst, you'll find out that you were wrong, and now you'll know the truth. At the best, you'll find out you were right, and you will humbly let everybody know that you were right, probably on social media in a way that nobody will believe what you have to say. And as you're researching these conspiracy theories, it is important to take your time. To not simply pull up Google, type in your question, find the first article, read the article, and say, there it is, I have found the answer. But instead, to truly research the question that you're asking, to have a plan, it is important to research all the evidence, not just read one article. Conspiracy theories are all around us. In church, we come together each and every week to talk about a conspiracy theory. In John chapter 1, we read that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Quite possibly, the biggest conspiracy theory that has haunted mankind since the beginning of all creation, and certainly in our lifetimes. Is this verse true? Gentlemen, ladies, I think we're going to be okay. Nobody pulled out a stone when I asked that question. Nobody gave me cross eyes when I looked at them and said this was a conspiracy theory, so I think we'll be okay this morning. You all may be dismissed and find your seats. Thank you very much for keeping me safe up here while we started this thing off. We often don't like to think about it that way, but this whole idea about Jesus truly is a conspiracy theory. Now, you could look at that two different ways. The conspiracy could be that he did exist, or the conspiracy could be set up as he didn't exist, or that he wasn't who he said he was. Now remember, going back, just because something is labeled a conspiracy theory does not make it not true. So this is not your pastor standing up in front of you and saying that Jesus is nothing but a conspiracy theory, but has it not been one that has the question asked over and over and over again, and people researching evidence piece by piece by piece as to whether or not Jesus did in fact live, whether or not Jesus did in fact die, and whether or not Jesus did in fact rise again. In following the evidence about Jesus, which I've been doing for, I'm 41, so I wouldn't say 41 years, because when I was just born, I wasn't asking these questions. But in the time that I've been asking these questions, there have been some crazy spots that I've been led in, some crazy questions that I've just kind of run down a rabbit trail here and there. And I want to throw one more thing out when it comes to investigating a conspiracy theory, is don't be afraid of where the investigation leads you. If you're walking along or you're researching, you're Googling, you're doing whatever you're doing, you're reading books, and all of a sudden you get to that point where you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to run down that trail. I would suggest most of the time that is a perfect trail to run down. You might get to the end of it and go, wow, that was a colossal waste of time. That did nothing for me. But it did, because what it did for you was hone your skills. What it did for you was get you to think a little bit deeper. And what it did for you was probably answer a few questions along the way. So in my time of investigating this, it was really within the last couple of weeks, I began to ask a question that I don't remember that I've ever asked before. And that is that in John chapter 1, we see that with Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God when all of time began. Okay, that's a conspiracy theory in and of itself. That's something that people debate over and over and over again. But within that, there was another theory, there was another question that kind of jumped out at me, and that was that, did time really restart because of Jesus? And here's what I mean by that. What prompted the beginning of what we live in now, known as the Common Era, CE, or known as AD, depending on which terminology you want to use? What prompted the resetting of the calendars back to a year one? Why not go all the way back to when creation began? And at that point, we'd be in year, well, it depends where you land on that one, whether we're in year millions or whether we're in year thousands. That's a theory all in of itself that we could investigate. But what prompted the fact that we restarted our calendars 2,025 years ago? Was it really Jesus that did this? Or is that just something that I was taught because I have grown up in a Western civilization, in a world that is heavily influenced by Christians? Now, I understand that we live in a world now that is, in the United States, that is often defined as post-Christian, but we are still heavily influenced by the history of Christianity. So did I just grow up with this idea that it all restarted with the birth of Jesus because this is the nation that I grew up with, or is there actually something to this? So, I did exactly what I said at the beginning that we're supposed to do when we have a conspiracy theory, and I jumped on Google. Because it is obviously the most, truthfully, I did jump on Google, but I found what I believe to be reliable sites, and I began to research where this all began. Now, for some of you, you're going to sit here and be like, wow, this is stuff that I think we were taught back in school, and I didn't even care then. And some of you are going to be like, oh, I didn't know some of this stuff. This is interesting. And for you young people, you're like, I thought we left school behind on Friday. I have to go back tomorrow. So what I'm saying with all that, I'm going to get through this quickly because I don't want you to feel like you're back in the classroom, but I do want to just unfold a little bit of where all this began. So here we go. The term AD, which we commonly refer to as the time after the birth of Jesus, means Anno Domini. It is a Latin word that means in the year of our Lord. Now, I grew up for a good portion of my life thinking that AD meant, and some of you might have been here with me, that AD meant after death. Yeah, many of you'd heard the same thing. Now, that threw me for a loop when I got a little bit older and I realized, but wait a second, if BC was before Christ, so that was when he was born, and AD meant after death, and that was, well, he died at 33, what happened to those 33 years in the middle there? Now, it took me a long time. I'm not going to say how long to ask that question. If you're sitting here and you're going, oh, I never realized that, I'm not making fun of you for that one because I'm not confessing how long that took me to get to that point. But it doesn't mean after death. No, it means in the year of our Lord. So in the year when Jesus was born. In 525 AD, now it wasn't called 525 AD yet at that point, a monk by the name of Dionysius Exiguus, and I probably completely butchered that name, and that's totally fine. I'm going to go by his nickname instead. His nickname was Dennis the Small. I appreciate anybody with the name Small in their nickname. He proposed that we begin to use this term AD for all of the years since Christ's birth. And so in the process of researching when Christ was born, he went back. He figured out when that was. He started to count up to it. He proposed to get away with the Diocletian system. We won't go into what all that was. And when he was all done, we found out as we look back that he completely miscalculated the year that Jesus was born, that Jesus would have actually been born somewhere between 6 and 4 BC. So we're off by 4 to 6 years. But historians would argue that is not a crucial issue. It still signifies that AD came around because of the birth of Jesus. Now, BC actually wasn't there when AD started. The term BC came along years later in 731 AD when the Venerable Bede of Northumbria expanded AD to include the years BC. In other words, to include, we got to have a way to number all those things that happened before Jesus was born. There is no year zero. I don't know if you knew that. I actually didn't realize that. Because Bede, the guy who came up with this idea of BC, didn't recognize, or this is weird to say, but believe in the number 0. And so it goes from 1 to 1. At least according to the Google websites that I found. It goes from 1 to 1. I hope that's correct. If I'm wrong on that one, you guys aren't going to believe anything else that I have to say this morning. And I realize that. In the 9th century AD, The Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne adopted this system for all the dating of acts of government that they would do. So from there on out, they began to use this AD BC to recognize, like on a bigger scale, what kind of things the government was doing. In the 15th century, all of Western Europe had adopted the BC AD system. In the 16th century, we introduced the Gregorian calendar. And in 1988, which is a lot more recent than I thought that any of these things would come up, the international standard it became the international standard through the International Organization for Standardization. Now I realize at this point, some of you you're glossing over, you're like, can you speed through this real quick? I've got like 4 more lines here. In 1715, they began to use different terms. They began to use BCE and CE, standing for the before the Common Era, and CE meaning the Common Era. And as you read textbooks, as you read scholarly things that are put out, what you will typically see now are not BC and AD, but you will see BCE and CE. And their reasoning for this, they were pretty straightforward. They wanted to make the non-Christians more comfortable. Because if you don't believe in Christ, it does seem a little bit weird to describe something as before Christ. So before that imaginary thing happens, this was the year that it was. And after that imaginary thing happened, so to make people more comfortable, they changed the before Common Era and the Common Era, which means many times what you will now see, when I was growing up, I grew up in 1983 AD. That's what I often saw. But now you would see that it is the year 2025 CE. And what it really comes down to is whether you use BC and AD, and there was an uproar, and there's probably still some, that we got rid of these terms because it erased Christ, or whether you use BCE and CE, the fact remains, the point of it all remains that something about Jesus prompted a reset. Regardless of the history that you look at, and regardless of the terminology that you want to use, whether you want to use BC, AD, or you use BCE and CE, history, the historical evidence continues over and over to point out that something happened with this man Jesus that was a big enough deal that it reset our counting on the calendar. The question then led me to, or the original question then led me to the next question, which is, what was it about him? It wasn't just because he had a bunch of followers. Because in the year that this happened, he didn't have the most followers. Even today, there are roughly 535 million Buddhists. Oh, I saw people smile when they looked at the screen. I was wondering what was up there. Sorry, I got a little distracted there. There are roughly 535 million Buddhists today, and he was around in the year somewhere between the 6th and the 4th century BCE when all that started happening and people started really worshiping and becoming Buddhists. Like that was well before Jesus walked on the earth. There are roughly 1.2 billion Hindus walking around today. And the earliest manuscripts that we have of people beginning to follow the Hindu religion go way back to 3000 BCE. In other words, 3,000 years before the reset of the calendar. 3,000 years before we say that Jesus walked on the earth. There are roughly 1.9 billion Muslims on the earth today. And Muhammad was born around 570 CE. So while there are roughly almost 2 billion Muslims, we didn't reset the calendar for Muhammad. There are roughly 2.4 billion Christians, or people who claim to follow Christ, who claim to be Christians in the world today. But in the year that it started, Christianity did not have the most followers. And it had not been around the longest. So this isn't just a numbers game. This isn't just they had more people and so they overpowered everybody else and they made the decisions that way. It wasn't just majority rules. It wasn't because Jesus had been around longer than any of the other founders of these other religions that were walking around. It wasn't because of those things, so we still go back to the question, what was it? It wasn't because everybody was in agreement about him, and it still isn't because everybody is in agreement about him. There are several things that most scholars would say that they agree on when it comes to Jesus, whether or not they claim to be atheists or whether or not they claim to be Christian scholars. Most would agree that Jesus was born in Bethlehem and he grew up in a town called Nazareth. Is it debatable? Sure. It's a long time ago, and records can get messed up, and people can debate, anything. I took debate in high school, and I literally debated things that I didn't agree with because it was the assignment that was put in front of me. So can we debate it? Absolutely, but very few do. It is not very often debated that Jesus was a teacher, that he was somebody who walked around and he taught people morals, he taught people ethics, and many would say he was even a pretty good one. But, again, we've had a lot of really good teachers and a lot of really influential moral and ethical people, and we haven't reset the calendar for any of them. Many would agree that Jesus was crucified on a cross. Now, in the Christian world, sometimes we think that was a unique thing and that sets him apart, but in reality, in the Roman world, crucifixion was common. In fact, they loved crucifying people because crucifying people was a way to get people in line. You don't want to go against the Roman government and have that be the result of going against us. It was not humane in any way, shape, or form. It wasn't like, here in the United States where we argue about how you should put people on death row and how you should put them to death on death row. No, it was hey, let's throw them up there so that everybody can see they messed up and everybody looks and says, I don't want this. So Jesus was by no means unique for being crucified on a cross. And so scholars have no issues with agreeing on that one. But they disagree on a lot more things about Jesus. They disagree on whether or not he was born of a virgin by divine intervention from the God of all creation. They disagree as to whether or not he did miracles or whether or not these could just be explained by natural phenomena or exaggeration by his followers who came along. And here's another disagreement. Followers who came along later, not even the originals, that these stories have just been blown out of proportion. They disagree as to whether or not he was crucified by a hesitant Roman officer. So they don't disagree that he was crucified and that Pilate sent him to the cross. What they disagree on, scholars, is whether or not Pilate was hesitant when he sent them up, that his wife's words meant anything to him in the gospel accounts that we read, or whether or not Pilate would have been like, no, just throw the guy on the cross. I don't care. Because in Pilate's character of everything else that we see, he wouldn't have given a rip. Killing people was not a big deal. They disagree as to whether or not Jesus actually died in the first place. He lost a lot of blood, people. Maybe Jesus finally just swooned. In other words, he passed out. You can read all sorts of proclamations that that's all that happened. They disagree as to whether or not he was actually buried in a tomb after his death. I could open up a book for you right now, and I could read probably 10 to 15 pages about how they would have gotten rid of the people who were crucified on the cross. And really, generally speaking, what they did is they left them there. And they let the birds start just eating away at them. And then when the birds were finally done, they took him down from the cross and they threw him in a mass grave and they let the dogs finish him off. And so the argument is made, why would Jesus be unique? They disagree as to whether or not he ever claimed to be God. They disagree as to whether or not he was and then still is divine. When he lived, people doubted him. When he rose, people doubted him. And centuries and millennia later, people still doubt him. The farther we get from any historical event, the harder it is to prove as to whether or not it ever happened. And so more and more people will keep asking questions. And yet, with all of these disagreements going on, remember, they didn't reset the calendar because everybody agreed that Jesus was a significant person, that Jesus, that he was God, that he rose from the dead. It wasn't because of that, but no matter how much people try to get rid of him or ignore him or deny him, it still remains a very rarely disputed fact. And I say that because I'm not going to say it's not disputed at all, because again, we will argue about anything, but a rarely disputed fact remains that the calendar reset because of Jesus. And 2,000 years after he walked on the earth, we still talk about him. And the question keeps coming back to, but why? What was it about Jesus? See, the fact that the calendar reset is not definitive proof that Jesus is who he claimed to be or that we claim for him to be. But what it is a link in the chain of evidence pointing in the direction that Jesus truly was indeed the Son of God. It doesn't prove it, but it is another piece of the puzzle that falls into place as we begin to run down these random questions that we find. What I would argue, and again, I can argue about anything because we can argue about whatever we want to. So what I would argue is that one thing that it does mostly kind of sort of prove is that Jesus was indeed the most influential man in history. Because while there have been so many others, there has been Napoleon, there has been Hitler, there has been we could go through presidents, there's been Martin Luther King, there's been Mother Teresa, there have been so many influential people throughout the course of history. Only one has set us all the way back to year one with his birth. And yet, for someone that influential, somebody who has that much impact on our lives. Now, we could make the argument that it really doesn't matter what year we're in. Who cares? But he's had so much impact on our lives, going to our calendar and to so many different moral teachings that we have and ethical teachings that we have, to laws that we have. All of this influence, and yet there are so many who walk around knowing so little about him. So many who have just barely scratched the surface as to who he is. So many people who have simply decided to just read the article and then move on and spend no time discovering who he really was and who he really is. So few people outside the church, but so few people inside the church who are willing to spend the time to truly understand who he is. Instead, what so many of us have chosen, and when I say this, church, I have barely scratched the surface as to who Jesus is. I'm not standing up here trying to put myself up as I am the resident expert when it comes to Jesus. No, every day I feel like I'm discovering more about who Jesus is, and he's revealing more about himself. But so often I and we have decided to keep this relationship with Jesus casual. Like, let's just know just a little bit about each other. We don't want to know too much about each other. But here's the thing about Jesus is that, and this is one of the reasons he is so influential, one of the reasons that the calendar reset is that Jesus is not interested in casual. He wants none of it. The writer of Hebrews, we read one of these verses last week. We're going to read a little bit more. The writer of Hebrews, and I say that way because we don't actually know who the writer of Hebrews is for sure. He sounds a lot like Paul, or she sounds a lot like Paul when you read it, but we don't know that for sure. But they write this in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 11, if you want to write that down or you want to look it up real quick. And we're going to read through chapter 6, verse 2. It says, "We have a great deal to say about this, and it's difficult to explain since you have become too lazy to understand. Although by this time, you ought to be teachers. You need someone to teach you the basic principles of God's revelation again." Now remember, he's not writing this to a non-Christian group of people. He's writing this to people just like you and me who have said, I believe in Jesus, I follow Jesus, I want to pursue Jesus with my whole life. And he or she is writing these words to them. You need milk, not solid food. Now everyone who lives on milk is inexperienced with the message about righteousness because he's an infant. But solid food is for the mature, for those whose senses have been trained to distinguish between good and evil. Therefore, leaving the elementary message about the Messiah, leaving behind this surface level, casual relationship stuff, let us go on to maturity. Not laying again, not having to talk about it all over again, the repentance from dead works, not having to talk about all over again faith in God, not having to talk about all over again teaching about ritual washings, not having to talk about all over again laying on of hands, not having to talk about all over again the resurrection of the dead, not having to talk about all over again eternal judgment. In other words, we should be at a point where we understand this stuff, people. That's what he or she is writing here. That it shouldn't be that every time we come back together, we have to hit on the same things. Because people, we should be spending time getting to know Jesus outside of the times where we just gather together. In other words, what the Hebrews writer is writing here is it's time to grow up. It's time to stop making the excuses about our faith of, well, I just don't know enough. I'm just not sure. He or she is saying, then find out. Don't just keep, actually, the word he or she uses, don't just keep being lazy about it. I wonder if maybe sometimes we, and by we, I mean we, not you, I mean we stick to the elementary message about Jesus because we don't want to find out that he really is God. We kind of like it as a theory in our lives. We kind of like it as one of those things that it might be true, but it might not be true, because if a theory doesn't have to turn my life upside down. If it's just a theory, then I can still keep on living my life with the hope that maybe it's not true. If it's just a theory, then I can keep telling the kid version of the Bible stories, instead of spending the time to discover why all that stuff was written down in the first place and how it impacts my life. If it's just a theory, if it's just the elementary message, then I can keep thinking of it all as just history. And it doesn't really have that much impact over my life. Yeah, sure, maybe it changed a few laws here and there, but it doesn't have to impact what I really believe. It doesn't have to impact who I really am. If I can keep it as a theory, it doesn't really have to change much at all about my life. Or maybe we stick with the elementary message because the writer of Hebrews absolutely hit it right on the nail. We're just lazy. It's a lot easier to look up the 30-second TikTok video than it is to actually form a relationship with Jesus Christ, than to actually give my life to him and figure out what that means. Oh, sure, I can say the words, I give my life to Jesus, but to truly figure out what that means, I can't be lazy about it. Or maybe we stick to the elementary message because then I can still keep some control in my life. I can still hang on to a few doubts, and as long as I have those doubts, then I can keep doing the things the way that I want to do them. Or maybe we think that we've outgrown this message about Jesus. You know, we've outgrown all these ideas. We've understood at this point that sometimes crazy things do happen. Or we've heard so many different theories about gravity and relativity and other ones that I can't even think of right now. We've just decided that Jesus is like basic math, and we've moved on to calculus at this point in our lives. Even to the point that I would say sometimes we come along in a conversation and with another believer, and we don't want to say words like, hey, Jesus has got this. because that's too childish to say something like that. The people that we read about in here, and the people that changed a calendar, that reset everything back to year one, they didn't keep it at an elementary message level. They didn't keep the relationship casual. They didn't just let somebody else figure out all the things about Jesus and then say, I'll just say his name every now and then. No, they didn't just read the article. They found out that there was something about this man. There was something about him that was worth leaving their jobs behind. There was something about him that was worth giving their literal lives for him. Imagine if something happened in your life, something happened in our world today that was such a big cataclysmic event that we reset the calendar all over again. Imagine how much that would overturn your life, that would turn everything upside down for us, if something that big were to happen. Church, that's what they're saying happened 2,025 years ago. Because if we find him, then he resets our lives. What was it about this man? See, it wasn't just that he was born. Everybody's born. That's no big deal. It wasn't just that he got older. Most people get older. That's no big deal. It really wasn't even a big deal that he was put on a cross or that he died. Because other than two people that we read about in Scripture, everybody dies, even Elvis. No, the big deal about this man would have to be that he rose again. And that this man who rose again comes to each and every individual and says, I want a relationship that is not casual with you. And if you'd like to keep it casual, I'm going to let you do that. But just know that you don't really know me. Because if you want to know me, I'm going to turn your life upside down. I'm going to reset it for you. I'm going to give you peace that you've never known, but you're going to have trials that you've never known too. I'm going to give you joy that is unexplainable, but yes, you're going to have sorrow too. I'm going to reset your life. And I'm going to give you purpose and meaning that you have never understood or never could without me. But not if you want to keep it casual. Not if you want to keep drinking milk. You're going to have to grow up. So, church, my question for us this morning is whether or not we are truly ready to test this theory. Are you willing to run down that trail and take it wherever it leads you, to not be afraid of the question that might pop up, to not be afraid or hesitant to put in the energy that it takes to discover who Jesus is? I'm not saying that now you all of a sudden need to start studying for 100 hours a week and reading every apologetics book that there is. But what if we truly put it to the test, and when we had a question, we didn't just push it to the back, but we actually ran with it? And what if we continually ask Jesus, will you please explain yourself to me? Will you reveal yourself to me? Church, to put it in the words of the Hebrew writer, are we ready to grow up? Because the world around us is desperate for the followers of Jesus to leave behind the elementary message about him and to grow up so that we too would be willing to lay our lives on the line because this influential man is that important. My prayer is that this church, this congregation, would be a people who are ready to grow up. My prayer is that we're all at that point. I know we're not. My prayer is that we would all get to that point. We are ready to say, Jesus, I want to know the real you. Would you pray with me? God, Thank you for revealing yourself to us. We know that there are so many different voices that we hear all around us that are claiming all sorts of different things about who you were, who you are, whether or not God, your Father, exists in the first place, whether or not you exist with God, all of those things. We hear all of these voices. And God, I know for myself, there have been so many times in my life where I've been hesitant to answer any of those questions. Sometimes maybe because I'm afraid of what I'm going to find, if I'm being honest, and other times because I just don't want to put in the effort. And God, I confess for myself this morning that I've been that way. God, I pray that you would give us the courage this morning to humbly walk together with you, to discover who it is that you are, so that we could, one, for ourselves, know you, but two, so that we could introduce a world to who you are. That we wouldn't have to go back to basic math Christianity, to elementary message Christianity every time we talk about you, but that we could understand you on a deeper, more intimate level and truly know who you are. God, I pray this in your name. Amen.